Ben Walker had been cleaning floors on the Galactic Trade Station for 3 years now. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept him fed. Most nights, he'd push his cleaning cart through empty corridors while the rest of the station slept. The hum of recycled air and the squeak of his mop against metal floors were his only companions. Tonight felt different though. Ben couldn't explain it, but something in the air seemed off as he made his way toward the cargo bays. These sections were usually abandoned after the evening shift, just rows of containers waiting to be shipped across the galaxy. It was the perfect place for a guy like him to work in peace. He was halfway through mopping Bay 7 when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it over the station's background noise. It was breathing, but not normal breathing. This was labored, desperate, like someone drowning in air. Ben stopped pushing his mop and listened. There it was again, coming from behind a stack of cargo containers near the back wall. His first instinct was to call security. Station protocol was crystal clear about unregistered life forms. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the fact that the sound reminded him of a sick puppy he'd found as a kid back on Earth. He left his cart and walked toward the containers, his footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. The breathing got louder as he approached. Ben pulled out his work light and shined it between the crates. That's when he saw it. Wedged in the narrow gap between two containers was a creature unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was small, maybe the size of a football, covered in scales that shimmered even in the dim light of his flashlight. The scales shifted colors as the creature breathed, flowing from deep blue to gold to something that looked almost purple. Its body was curled up tight, wings folded against its sides, and its eyes were closed. Ben knelt down and got closer. The creature's breathing was shallow and rapid. He could see its small chest rising and falling with effort. Whatever this thing was, it was dying. He should walk away. He should call this in and let the station's xenobiology team handle it. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But Ben had never been great at doing the smart thing. Instead, he reached into the gap slowly, speaking softly like his mother used to do with scared animals. His hand touched the creature's scales and he was surprised by how cold they felt. The thing should have been warm, right? Most living creatures generated heat. The moment his fingers made contact, the creature's eyes snapped open. They were huge compared to its small head, dark as space itself, and filled with a mix of fear and pain that made Ben's chest tighten. They stared at each other for a long moment, human and something definitely not human, and Ben saw something in those eyes he recognized. Desperation. The kind that comes when you're completely alone and convinced no one's coming to help. Ben made his decision right there. He carefully worked his hands around the creature's body and lifted it free from the gap. It was lighter than he expected, and he could feel its tiny heart racing against his palms. The creature made a small sound, something between a whimper and a chirp, then went still in his hands. Not dead still, just exhausted still. Like it had used up everything it had left just to stay alive this long. He looked around the cargo bay, his mind racing. If he called this in, they'd take the creature to the lab. They'd run tests, ask questions, probably quarantine the whole section. And this little thing didn't look like it had time for bureaucracy and medical procedures. It needed help now. Ben unzipped his work jacket and gently placed the creature inside against his chest. The moment it touched his body heat, it made that small chirping sound again and pressed closer. Its cold scales started to warm up, drawing heat from him like a battery charging. Ben zipped his jacket back up carefully, leaving just enough room for the creature to breathe. Walking back to his cart felt like the longest walk of his life. Every step, he expected security to round the corner and catch him. Every camera he passed felt like it was focused directly on the small bulge in his jacket. But no alarms went off. No security teams appeared. The station kept humming along, completely unaware that Ben Walker had just committed what was technically alien smuggling. He finished his shift on autopilot, his mind barely registering the motions of mopping and emptying trash bins. All he could think about was the small warm weight against his chest and those dark eyes that had looked at him like he was the last hope in the universe. When his shift finally ended, Ben headed straight to his quarters. His room was tiny, just a bed, a small desk, and a storage locker. Single station workers didn't get much space. But it was private, and right now privacy was exactly what he needed. He sat on his bed and carefully unzipped his jacket. The creature stirred, opening its eyes again. This time there was less fear in them. It looked up at him and made a soft trilling sound, almost like a question. "Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing either," Ben said quietly. He placed the creature on his pillow and it immediately curled into a ball, conserving heat. Its breathing was still rough but maybe slightly better than before. Ben looked at his work schedule on his tablet. He had 16 hours before his next shift. 16 hours to figure out how to keep this thing alive. He had no idea what it ate, what temperature it needed, or even what species it was. He didn't know if it was someone's lost pet or an endangered species or something completely unknown to science. What he did know was that he couldn't let it die. Not after it had looked at him with those eyes. Not after it had trusted him enough to let him pick it up. Ben pulled up the station's market directory on his tablet and started searching. Nutrient paste, heat lamps, medical supplies. This was going to cost him at least 2 weeks' pay, probably more. There went his savings for new boots. There went his plan to upgrade his quarters next month. He looked back at the creature on his pillow. It had opened one eye and was watching him with what almost looked like curiosity. "You better be worth it," Ben muttered, but he was already pulling on his jacket to head to the market. Because deep down he knew the creature already was. 3 weeks had passed since Ben found the creature, and his life had become a careful balancing act between his janitorial duties and secret caretaking. The hatchling, as he'd started calling it, had grown stronger with each passing day. What began as a fragile, cold creature barely clinging to life had transformed into something energetic and surprisingly playful. Ben had spent nearly every credit he had on supplies. The nutrient paste from the alien market seemed to work well enough, though he'd gone through trial and error to figure out the right mixture. Too thick and the hatchling wouldn't eat it. Too thin and it would make a mess all over his quarters. He'd rigged up a heat lamp using parts from the maintenance closet, setting it at just the right angle so the creature could bask under it when it needed warmth. The best part was watching the hatchling recognize him. Whenever Ben came home from his shift, those dark eyes would light up and the creature would make excited chirping sounds. It had started following him around his tiny quarters, its small claws clicking on the metal floor. Sometimes it would curl up in his lap while he ate his meals, its scales warm and smooth under his hand. But the hatchling was getting harder to hide. It had nearly doubled in size and was becoming more curious about everything. Yesterday, it had knocked over his lamp trying to catch the light reflection on the wall. The crash had been loud enough that his neighbor, a grumpy Hellan trader named Voss, had banged on the wall and shouted something about keeping the noise down. Ben knew he was running out of time. Sooner or later, someone would notice. Someone would ask questions. And then station security would get involved, and they'd take the hatchling away to some research facility where it would spend the rest of its life in a cage being studied. That thought made Ben's stomach turn. He'd spent too many nights talking to the creature, telling it stories about Earth, watching it tilt its head like it was trying to understand his words. This wasn't just some animal anymore. It trusted him, depended on him, and he couldn't let it down. So Ben started spending his free time in the station's library, searching through databases he barely understood. He ran image searches, comparing the hatchling's features to thousands of known species. Most nights he'd fall asleep at the terminal, his head on the desk, dreaming of scales and stars. It was on the 18th day that he finally found a match. The entry was old, buried deep in the historical archives. The Skaroth, dragon-like beings from the Draconis system. The file said they were ancient, powerful, and had mysteriously withdrawn from all galactic contact over 200 years ago. Nobody knew why they'd disappeared. Nobody knew if they were even still alive. But the images matched perfectly. The scales, the wing structure, the way the eyes reflected light. This was what his hatchling would grow into someday. Something magnificent and huge, something that needed open sky and space to fly, not a cramped janitor's quarters on a space station. Ben sat back in his chair and felt his heart sink. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but seeing the truth laid out in front of him made it real. The hatchling needed to go home. It needed to find its own kind, to live the life it was meant to live. The coordinates for Draconis space were in the file. It was far, way out on the edge of known space in a region most traders avoided. Getting there would cost more money than Ben had. More money than he could save in a year of working double shifts. He started asking around the docks during his breaks, being careful not to draw too much attention. Most cargo haulers laughed when he mentioned Draconis space. Too far, too empty, no profit in going out there. But finally he found a captain desperate enough to consider it. The guy ran an old freight ship that had seen better days, and he was willing to make the trip if the price was right. The price was every credit Ben had saved, plus everything he could get from selling his few possessions. His good work boots, his tablet, the nice jacket his sister had sent him from Earth, even the watch his father had given him before he died. Ben sold it all and still had to negotiate payment plans with the captain. The night before they were scheduled to leave, Ben sat on his bed with the hatchling curled in his lap. It looked up at him with those trusting eyes, making soft, contented sounds. It had no idea what was coming. "I'm sorry," Ben whispered, running his hand along its scaled back. I wish I could keep you. I really do. But you deserve better than this. You deserve to be with your family wherever they are. The hatchling chirped and nuzzled against his hand. Ben felt his throat get tight and his eyes burn. He'd promised himself he wouldn't get attached, but that ship had sailed weeks ago. The journey took 19 days. Ben had arranged for leave from his job, claiming a family emergency. The cargo ship was cramped and smelled like engine oil, but the captain didn't ask questions about the covered crate Ben kept in his bunk. The hatchling seemed to sense something was happening. It was quieter than usual, staying close to Ben, watching him with worried eyes. As they approached Draconis space, Ben could see it through the small viewport. A cluster of star systems bathed in reddish light, beautiful and strange. The captain dropped them off on an uninhabited moon orbiting the system's edge. It was the closest he'd go. Ben carried the hatchling out onto the moon's surface. The gravity was lighter here, and the sky above them was painted in shades of crimson and orange from the nearby star. It was beautiful in a way that made Earth seem small and far away. He set the hatchling down on the rocky ground. For a long moment they just looked at each other. The creature seemed confused, tilting its head and making questioning sounds. Its wings, stronger now than when he'd found it, spread slightly as if testing the air. This is where you need to be, Ben said, his voice cracking despite his effort to stay calm. Your family is out there somewhere. They're looking for you. I know they are. The hatchling took a few steps away, then looked back at him. Those dark eyes were filled with something that looked heartbreakingly like confusion and hurt. Why are you leaving me? They seemed to ask. Ben crouched down and touched the creature's head one last time. You're going to grow up big and strong. You're going to fly across stars and do amazing things. And maybe if I'm really lucky, you'll remember the guy who found you in a cargo bay and tried his best. He stood up and stepped back. The hatchling chirped urgently, taking a step toward him. Ben forced himself to turn away and walk back to the ship. Each step felt like pulling against gravity. Behind him, he could hear the creature calling out, its voice echoing across the empty moon. The captain was waiting at the airlock. You sure about this? He asked, not unkindly. Ben didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded and climbed aboard. Through the viewport, he watched as the ship lifted off. The hatchling was still there on the surface, looking up at the sky. Then, as if understanding finally clicked, it spread its wings fully and launched itself into the air. Ben watched it fly toward the crimson horizon, getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. The journey back felt longer than the journey out. Ben sat in his bunk, staring at the empty space where the hatchling's crate had been. His quarters back on the station would feel even emptier, he knew. No excited chirping when he came home. No warm weight in his lap during meals. Just silence and the memory of dark eyes that had trusted him completely. When he finally returned to the Galactic Trade Station, Ben went straight back to work. He picked up his mop, pushed his cart through the same corridors, and tried to fall back into the rhythm of his old life. But at night, lying in his bed, he'd touch the spot where the hatchling used to sleep and wonder if he'd done the right thing. He told himself he had. The creature needed to be with its own kind. It needed freedom and open space, not a hidden life in a janitor's quarters. But that didn't make his empty room feel any less lonely. 6 months had crawled by since Ben left the hatchling on that distant moon. Life had settled back into its old routine, though something fundamental had changed inside him. The station felt different now, more hollow somehow. He'd wake up each morning, put on his maintenance uniform, and head out to clean floors that would just get dirty again tomorrow. It was the same job he'd been doing for years, but now it felt more mechanical, like he was just going through the motions. His coworkers noticed he'd gotten quieter. Ben had never been the most talkative guy, but now he barely said more than a few words during shift changes. He'd eat his meals alone in the corner of the cafeteria, watching the crowds of aliens and humans mingle and laugh, feeling disconnected from all of it. At night, he'd lie in his bunk and stare at the ceiling, sometimes reaching over to the empty spot where a small dragon used to sleep, before catching himself and pulling his hand back. The credits he'd spent to take the hatchling home had wiped him out completely. He was back to wearing his old worn-out boots with the sole coming loose on the left one. His tablet was a borrowed one from the station's employee pool, slow and glitchy. But none of that really bothered him. What bothered him was not knowing if he'd made the right choice. Did the hatchling find its family? Was it safe? Was it even still alive? These questions circled his mind constantly, but there was no way to get answers. Draconis space was too far away, too isolated. And even if he could somehow afford another trip, what would be the point? The creature was gone. That chapter of his life was over. The Galactic Trade Station hummed along with its usual chaos, completely indifferent to Ben's quiet melancholy. Thousands of beings passed through every day. Merchants from the outer colonies hawking exotic goods. Diplomats in expensive suits negotiating treaties. Miners spending their hard-earned pay at the bars. Families traveling between worlds. Everyone had somewhere to go, something important to do. Ben just pushed his mop and stayed invisible, exactly the way he'd always been. It was a Tuesday night, or at least what the station's artificial schedule called Tuesday, when everything changed. Ben was working the late shift in Sector 9, methodically cleaning the corridors near the main promenade. The crowds had thinned out to just a handful of stragglers. A group of Hellion miners were loudly celebrating something at the bar down the hall. A Ventarian couple argued about directions near the information kiosk. Normal station business. Then the alarm started screaming. The sound was deafening, bouncing off the metal walls and making Ben's ears ring. Red emergency lights began flashing in rotating patterns, turning everything into a nightmare of shadows and crimson. The automated announcement system kicked in, its mechanical voice cutting through the chaos with words that made Ben's blood run cold. Alert! Unidentified vessels detected approaching station perimeter. All personnel report to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Ben had worked on the station for 3 years and had never heard that announcement before. There were drills occasionally, sure, but this was different. The panic in people's voices was real. Around him, the relaxed evening atmosphere shattered instantly. The miners stopped celebrating and started running toward the residential sections. The Ventarian couple abandoned their argument and rushed for the nearest shelter point. Ben dropped his mop and ran with the crowd toward the observation windows. He needed to see what was happening. Dozens of other people had the same idea, pressing against the reinforced glass that looked out into space. What Ben saw through that window made his legs weak. They were coming out of hyperspace like sharks emerging from dark water. Massive shapes that bent light around them, creating ripples in space itself. At first, Ben thought they were ships, some new kind of vessel he'd never seen before. But as his eyes adjusted and his brain caught up with what he was seeing, he realized the horrible, wonderful truth. They weren't ships. They were alive. Dragons. Enormous beyond comprehension, each one easily as large as the cargo freighters that docked at the station regularly. Their scales caught and reflected starlight in ways that seemed impossible, colors flowing across their bodies like living auroras. Some were deep blue with hints of silver. Others were gold and red like burning suns. A few were so dark they were almost invisible against the void of space, visible only when they moved and starlight caught their edges. Their wings stretched out impossibly wide, and Ben could see they weren't just flesh and bone but something else, something that seemed to manipulate space itself. When they moved, they didn't fly so much as flow through the emptiness, graceful and terrifying in equal measure. Ben counted 12, then 20, then lost count as more kept arriving. They emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, surrounding the station in a sphere pattern that military commanders would have envied. And then they just stopped, hovering there in the black, waiting. The observation deck had gone completely silent. Everyone was pressed against the windows now, staring at the impossible sight before them. Ben heard someone whisper "Skarath," in a voice filled with awe and fear. The word spread through the crowd like wildfire. The Skarath. The ancient dragons that had disappeared centuries ago. The species that existed only in historical files and legends whispered in the dark corners of space stations. Station security was going absolutely crazy. Through the intercom, Ben could hear frantic orders being shouted. Battle stations were being manned even though everyone knew it was pointless. What could their small defensive weapons do against creatures that size? It would be like shooting at mountains with a pistol. But the dragons weren't attacking. They just surrounded the station, silent and still, their massive eyes watching. Waiting for something. Ben's hands were shaking as he pressed them against the cold glass. His heart hammered in his chest so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Somewhere in the back of his mind, an impossible thought was forming. A thought so crazy he almost laughed at himself for thinking it. Could this have something to do with the hatchling? No, that was insane. He'd found one small creature dying in a cargo bay. He'd taken care of it for a few weeks and then released it near Draconis space. That was months ago. There was no way that this massive fleet of ancient dragons showing up at this specific station could have anything to do with him. The universe didn't work that way. Small people like Ben Walker didn't accidentally trigger galactic events by showing kindness to a dying animal. But even as he told himself this, Ben couldn't shake the feeling in his gut that his life was about to change forever. The largest dragon moved forward from the formation. It was absolutely massive, making the others look small by comparison. Its scales seemed to contain entire galaxies, swirling with colors that hurt to look at directly. Age radiated from it like heat from a star. This was something ancient, something that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. The dragon opened its enormous mouth, and Ben half expected fire to pour out. Instead, a sound emerged that made every speaker on the station crackle and pop. It took a moment for Ben to realize it was trying to communicate. The station's translation systems kicked in, fighting to make sense of sounds that were never meant for human ears. Finally, through the static and interference, words came through in clear, precise English. "We seek an audience with the human called Ben Walker." The observation deck erupted in confused voices. People were looking around, trying to figure out who Ben Walker was and why dragons wanted to talk to him. Ben stood frozen, his mind completely blank, unable to process what he'd just heard. Someone grabbed his shoulder. It was his supervisor, looking pale and terrified. "Walker? You're Ben Walker, right? What the hell did you do?" Ben couldn't answer. He could barely breathe. All he could do was stare at the massive dragon fleet hanging in space like a promise and a threat all rolled into one. And somewhere in that formation, he was certain, were a pair of dark eyes that remembered a cold cargo bay and a human who'd chosen kindness when no one was watching. "Retry us." Ben's supervisor was gripping his shoulder so hard it hurt, demanding answers Ben didn't have. Around him, the crowd on the observation deck had turned to stare. Some faces showed confusion, others showed fear, and a few showed something that looked dangerously close to anger. After all, a fleet of ancient dragons had just shown up asking for one specific person, and that person was standing right here among them. Before Ben could say anything, security officers pushed through the crowd. There were 4 of them, all wearing the standard station security uniform, all looking extremely nervous. The lead officer, a tall woman named Rodriguez that Ben had seen around but never really talked to, stepped forward. "Ben Walker?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Yeah, that's me," Ben managed to say, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "You need to come with us. Now." It wasn't a request. They escorted him through corridors that had been emptied by the emergency protocols. Their boots echoed on the metal floors and Ben's old worn-out shoes squeaked with every step. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? The security team probably had just as many questions as he did, and none of them had any answers. They took him to the main docking bay, the largest one on the station, usually reserved for diplomatic vessels and VIP arrivals. Ben had only been in here a handful of times, always to clean up after some fancy event. Now it was empty except for station administrators, security personnel, and what looked like every high-ranking official who happened to be on board. The station commander, a stern Martian named Hayes who Ben had only ever seen from a distance, was barking orders into a comm unit. When he saw Ben arrive, he stopped mid-sentence and walked over. His face was red, whether from anger or stress Ben couldn't tell. "Walker, I'm going to ask you this once and I need a straight answer. What did you do to provoke the Skarath?" Ben blinked. "I didn't provoke anyone. I just..." "Those things out there don't just show up asking for random janitors by name," Hayes interrupted. "So either you're going to tell me what's going on, or I'm going to have you locked up while we figure this out." Before Ben could respond, the massive bay doors began to open. The atmospheric shield shimmered to life, a blue membrane of energy that would keep the air in while allowing solid objects to pass through. Everyone in the bay took an instinctive step backward. The largest dragon descended through the opening with impossible grace for something so massive. Her movements were fluid and controlled, and as she entered the bay, Ben could see details he'd missed from the observation window. Her scales weren't just colored, they were deep, like looking into infinity. Galaxies seemed to swirl within them, tiny stars twinkling across her hide. Her eyes were ancient and knowing, the kind of eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of worlds. She was absolutely terrifying and absolutely beautiful at the same time. Behind her came a smaller dragon, though smaller was relative. This one was still huge, maybe the size of a shuttlecraft, with scales that shifted between blue and gold. And when those eyes locked onto Ben, his breath caught in his throat. He knew those eyes. He'd looked into them every day for 3 weeks. He'd seen them filled with pain and fear and trust. They were older now, more confident, but unmistakably the same. The hatchling. His hatchling. She'd come back. The matriarch lowered her enormous head, and when she spoke, her voice filled the entire bay. It was deep and resonant, and the translation came through perfectly this time, each word carefully pronounced in English. "I am called Keeper of Stars, Matriarch of the Skarath, Guardian of the Draconis worlds. I seek the human known as Ben Walker." Ben's legs felt like water, but he forced himself to step forward. His voice came out smaller than he intended. "I'm Ben Walker." The ancient dragon's eyes focused on him, and Ben felt like he was being examined down to his atoms. Around him he could hear people holding their breath. Commander Hayes had gone completely silent. "6 months ago," the matriarch began, "you found my granddaughter dying in a forgotten corner of this station. You were not required to help her. You gained nothing from helping her. Yet you chose to save her life." Ben glanced at the smaller dragon, who was watching him with what could only be described as joy. Her tail swished back and forth like an excited puppy, and if dragons could smile, she was definitely smiling. Ben started, then stopped. How could he explain? She was hurt. I couldn't just leave her there. Could you not? The matriarch's voice was curious, not accusatory. Many of your kind would have walked past. Many would have reported her to authorities. Some would have seen profit in capturing her. But you saw a suffering creature and chose compassion. You fed her from your own provisions. You gave her warmth from your own body. You spent your wealth to ensure her survival. Ben felt his face getting hot. He hadn't thought about it that way. He'd just done what felt right. The matriarch continued, her voice growing stronger. What you could not know, what you had no way of knowing, is that my granddaughter was the last survivor of her bloodline. A plague swept through our nursery worlds 3 years ago. It took her parents, her siblings, her entire family. We searched the trade routes for survivors and found nothing. We mourned her as lost. As dead. The smaller dragon made a soft sound, and the matriarch's expression softened slightly before she turned back to Ben. When she returned to us, when she told us her story through the memories we Skarath can share, we were astounded. A human stranger had found her at her weakest moment and shown her nothing but kindness. You asked for nothing. You expected nothing. And when she grew strong enough, you took her to our space so she could find her home, even though it cost you everything you had. Commander Hayes was staring at Ben like he'd never seen him before. The other officials were whispering to each other, their expressions ranging from shock to disbelief. The matriarch moved closer, lowering her massive head until it was level with Ben. He could see his reflection in her eyes, tiny and insignificant next to this ancient being. The Skarath do not forget, Ben Walker. We remember every kindness and every cruelty for 10,000 generations. We remember those who helped us and those who harmed us. And we honor our debts. She reached into a fold of her scales with one massive claw and withdrew something. It was a medallion hanging from a chain that looked like woven starlight. The medallion itself seemed to be made of the same material as dragon scales, shifting colors in the light, warm and alive. This is the mark of flame kin, the matriarch explained. It is given only to those we consider family. Only 3 other beings in the entire galaxy carry this mark, and all of them saved Skarath lives at great personal cost. You are the first human to ever receive this honor. She placed the medallion around Ben's neck with surprising gentleness. The moment it touched his chest, he felt warmth spread through him, like standing in sunlight after a long winter. From this moment forward, you are under the protection of the Skarath. Any who threaten you threaten us all. Any who harm you will face the wrath of every dragon in the Draconis system. You are flamekin, Ben Walker. You are family. Ben couldn't speak. His throat was too tight, his emotions too overwhelming. He looked past the matriarch to the smaller dragon, his hatchling, who had moved closer. She pressed her head gently against his shoulder, making the same soft chirping sound she used to make in his quarters. "Thank you," she said, her voice transmitted through a translator device. "Thank you for not walking away." Ben raised a shaking hand and touched her scaled head, just like he used to. "You came back," he whispered. "I never forgot you," she replied simply. Around them, the bay had erupted in noise as people realized what had just happened. A janitor, a nobody who pushed a mop for minimum wage, had just been declared family by one of the most ancient and powerful species in the galaxy. But Ben barely heard any of it. All he could focus on was the warm weight of the medallion against his chest and the dragon who remembered a kindness shown in the dark. The news spread through the galaxy faster than light itself. Within hours, every major news network was running the story. A human janitor had saved a dragon hatchling and earned the protection of the entire Skarath species. The footage of the ceremony in the docking bay played on repeat across 1,000 worlds. Ben's face, looking shocked and overwhelmed, became one of the most recognizable images in known space practically overnight. The political ramifications were immediate and massive. Humanity had always been something of a middle-tier species in galactic politics. Not weak enough to be ignored but not powerful enough to demand real respect. They had decent technology, reasonable military strength, and solid trade relationships, but they weren't major players in the grand scheme of things. That changed the moment the mark of Flamekin touched Ben's chest. The Krenth Empire, which had been aggressively expanding into human-controlled space for the past 2 years, withdrew their fleet within 48 hours. Their official statement talked about reassessing strategic priorities, but everyone knew what it really meant. Nobody wanted to pick a fight with a species under Scaroth protection. The dragons hadn't been seen in galactic affairs for over 2 centuries, but their reputation had only grown in their absence. Stories of their power had become legends, and legends had become warnings whispered in the dark. Pirate clans that regularly raided human cargo ships suddenly found themselves being hunted. The Scaroth could track ships through hyperspace using methods nobody understood, and they didn't bother with trials or negotiations. 3 separate pirate operations were completely destroyed in the first week, their ships torn apart by dragons that appeared out of nowhere. Word spread quickly in the criminal underworld, human ships were now off limits. Trade negotiations that had been stalled for years suddenly resolved in humanity's favor. Colonies that had been struggling to get supplies found their shipments arriving ahead of schedule. Defense contracts that seemed impossible to secure were suddenly being offered with favorable terms. Everyone wanted to be friends with the species that had befriended dragons. And at the center of all this chaos was Ben Walker, who just wanted to go back to mopping floors. The station commander had offered him a promotion immediately. A private suite, a position as special liaison to the Scaroth, a salary that made Ben's head spin. The station's politicians practically tripped over themselves trying to get meetings with him. Ambassadors from a dozen different species requested audiences. A Ventarian duchess offered him a villa on her homeworld. A mining corporation wanted to name an asteroid after him. Ben turned them all down. He kept his janitor job, much to everyone's confusion. When Commander Hayes asked him why, Ben just shrugged and said he liked the work. It was honest and simple, and after everything that had happened, simple felt like exactly what he needed. There was something calming about the routine, about making dirty things clean, about maintaining order in small ways that nobody else noticed. But his life had changed in ways he couldn't refuse. The medallion around his neck was impossible to hide, and people noticed. Merchants who used to look right through him now bowed their heads respectfully when he passed. The other janitors treated him differently, with a mix of awe and discomfort that made casual conversation impossible. Even Voss, his grumpy neighbor, had knocked on his door to apologize for all the times he'd complained about noise. The hardest part was the loneliness. Ben had never been popular, but he'd had a comfortable anonymity before. Now he was famous, and fame built walls between him and everyone else. People didn't see Ben Walker the janitor anymore. They saw Ben Walker the Flamekin, the dragon friend, the guy who changed galactic politics by showing kindness to a dying creature. The only one who still treated him like himself was Dawnfire. That's what the young dragon's name translated to in English, and she visited him once a month like clockwork. She'd land in the main docking bay, much to the excitement of station security, and spend hours with Ben in the observation deck. They'd sit together, a human janitor and a dragon the size of a small spacecraft, and just talk. Ben would tell her stories about Earth, about the mountains in Colorado where he grew up, about his sister and her kids, about the first time he saw snow. Dawnfire would tell him about the Scaroth homeworlds, about crystal caves that sang in the solar wind, about ancient cities built into asteroids, about the long and sorrowful history of her people. Sometimes other dragons would come with her. Younger ones mostly, curious about the human who'd saved one of their own. They'd ask him questions about humanity, about why he'd helped Dawnfire, about whether all humans were like him. Ben never quite knew how to answer that last one. Some are, he'd say carefully. Most people are good when given the chance. They just get scared or busy or convinced that their problems are more important than someone else's suffering. The dragons would consider this, their massive heads tilting in thought, and Ben wondered what conclusions they were drawing about his species. 3 months after the recognition ceremony, Dawnfire arrived with news. She landed in the bay and immediately sought out Ben, who was in the middle of cleaning the cafeteria. She found him on his hands and knees, scrubbing a stubborn stain some careless trader had left on the floor. Ben, she said, her voice excited through the translator. The Council of Matriarchs wants to meet you. All of them, not just my grandmother. They want to establish formal relations with humanity. Ben sat back on his heels, still holding his scrub brush. What? I mean, isn't the protection thing enough? You don't understand, Dawnfire said, moving closer. The Scaroth withdrew from galactic affairs because we lost faith in the other species. We saw too much cruelty, too much selfishness, too much disregard for life. We decided it was safer to isolate ourselves than to watch the galaxy tear itself apart. But I didn't do anything special, Ben protested. I just helped someone who needed help. Exactly, Dawnfire replied, and her eyes held that same trusting look they'd had when she was small and dying in a cargo bay. You did it without thinking of reward or recognition. You did it because it was right. And when we searched your world's networks to learn more about you, we found millions of stories like yours. Humans running into burning buildings to save strangers. Humans sharing their food with the hungry. Humans standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. You reminded us that compassion still exists in the galaxy. That not everything is transaction and territory. The Council believes humanity might be the bridge that brings us back to the wider universe. But they want to meet the one who started it all. Ben looked down at his scrub brush, at his worn-out uniform, at the stain he'd been fighting for the past 10 minutes. Then he looked up at this magnificent creature who'd traveled across the galaxy just to see him. Okay, he said. But I'm finishing this floor first. A job's a job. Dawnfire made a sound that might have been laughter. This is exactly why they want to meet you. That evening, after his shift ended, Ben stood at the observation window looking out at the stars. The medallion around his neck was warm against his chest, pulsing gently like a second heartbeat. Somewhere out there, an entire species of dragons was watching over humanity because one man had refused to walk past suffering. Ben thought about his father, who taught him that character was what you did when nobody was watching. He thought about his mother, who'd always stop to help injured animals on the side of the road. He thought about all the small, invisible acts of kindness that happened every day across the galaxy, unrecorded and unrewarded. Maybe that was the real story here. Not that Ben had done something extraordinary, but that he'd done something ordinary with extraordinary consequences. He'd seen someone in pain and helped them. That was it. That was the whole story. And somehow, that simple act had reminded an ancient species that the galaxy was worth engaging with again. Ben touched the medallion and smiled. Tomorrow he'd meet with dragon matriarchs and probably more diplomats and politicians. There would be ceremonies and negotiations and all sorts of complicated things he didn't fully understand. But tonight he was just Ben Walker, a janitor who'd once found a dying hatchling and decided to care. And really, when he thought about it, that was enough. That was more than enough. Dawnfire had been right about one thing: humans did run into burning buildings for strangers. They did share their food with the hungry. They did stand up for the voiceless. Not all of them, not always, but enough. Enough to matter. And maybe, just maybe, that was humanity's real strength. Not their technology or their military or their economic power, but their stubborn, foolish, wonderful insistence on caring about others, even when it cost them everything. Ben picked up his cleaning cart and headed back to his quarters. His floor wouldn't mop itself tomorrow, and dragons or no dragons, he had a job to do. Because at the end of the day, that's what mattered most. Doing your job well, treating people with kindness, and never walking past someone who needs help. Everything else, the politics and the fame and the galaxy-changing consequences, that was just what happened when ordinary people chose to be decent. And in a universe that often felt cold and indifferent, that choice made all the difference.